Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Plugged into History in its new format, and this is Explore More Thursday. So again, I promised you a video, hopefully you've seen that by now, of the new format that Plugged into History will be taking. If you didn't, scroll down on the page and you should be able to find one. From now on, Thursdays are going to be Explore More Thursdays, and today we would like to continue our conversation from Tuesday. So if you don't remember, my name is Carin Bloom. I'm the Director of Engagement here at Middleton Place Foundation, and usually I'm behind the camera, but today we have an incredible conversation that is building on the one that Tracey and I had yesterday with Dr. Robert Bellinger. So I'm going to switch my view here to gallery view so that you can see our guests. Of course, Tracey Todd, President and CEO of Middleton Place Foundation. And today we are talking with Dr. Bellinger. He is an associate professor at Suffolk University. He is the director of the Black Studies program there and also the director of the Clark Collection of African-American Literature. And of course, he is, not of course, we're grateful to say that he is a descendant of Middleton Place as well. So Dr. Bellinger, thank you so much for being here. We really look forward to speaking with you today and to learning from you today. So let's start out, if you wouldn't mind telling us a little bit about yourself, whatever you'd like to share with our digital audience.
Hello, how is everyone? My name is Robert Bellinger. I'm a professor of history and Black studies at Suffolk University. I live in the Boston area and have spent some time in South Carolina where I have family roots. That's a brief enough biography of me.
Well, let me jump in there. My name is Tracey Todd. Everyone, you know me. I hope and I think I'm president and CEO of Middleton Place Foundation. Last summer, we were very pleased and excited to have Bob come and spend time with us here as visiting scholar. And it wasn't our first experience spending time with Bob. He's just one of my favorite people in the world. Gotten to know Robert through the reunions that happen here at Middleton Place, and just feel, you know, he's just such a. I feel sort of a kindred spirit with Bob, and whenever we don't spend as much time together as we'd like because we're here in Charleston and he's up in Boston, but boy, one day it would be great if he got a gig down here at College of Charleston and we could spend more time with him. But we definitely enjoyed last summer when he was here, and just wanted to say how much we really love and appreciate Bob and thank him for being here with us.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Well, I think we should start off, Dr. Bellinger, with picking up some of the conversation that we had on Tuesday, which included talking about how history and how the foundation of systemic injustice really lives at places like Middleton Place, and how the history that we tell can and should be an instrument to help and educate everybody about those systems and those inequities in the system, and how they directly relate to today, not just the way that society is structured, but especially when we see tragedies unfold right before us over and over and over again. And so is there anything that you can point to for us to talk about how Middleton Place either can or does make these connections between the past and the present?
Well, one of the things that I'm always guided by, and it's from words of people much more wise than I am, who basically have said that history is always present, right? And so it's not in the past as many people think. It's always with us because we are connected to that past in many ways. And I think one of the biggest challenges that we have in the United States is how do we talk about that past? And how, especially, do we talk about the difficult topics from that past? And what we have to understand is that there really isn't just one American story. There are multiple, and we are seeing playing out in front of us two versions of that story. And these two different stories are intertwined, of course, but they are different. And if we just look at Middleton Place, for example, when we talk about the Middleton family, one of the things that's very important is that they were active in the colonial governments, that one of them signed the Declaration of Independence, and they were part of building the nation, which is very important. But we also talk about the fact that they were slaveholders. And so we're engaged in withholding liberty. So around this question of liberty, we have a real challenge, because liberty, in the strict American sense, looking at mainstream, also involved the right for whites to hold Black people in slavery. That was part of their liberty. That was part of their economic justice, their economic, viability was that right. For those people of African descent, liberty meant the right to not be held in bondage. And so these two versions of liberty are at odds with one another, right? And so we see that playing out now when we have people calling for opening the market because their liberty is connected to the economy, even though that means that it's impacting the liberty of Black and brown and poor people who are going to be working in those environments when they're not safe. And so their liberty doesn't connect to the market, it connects to something else. So we have this constant pull between the well-being of all the people and the well-being of the economy. And those are two different liberties, and no one is talking about that in that way.
That's a great point. That's a really not as subtle as people think it is divergence. I mean, that's really something that should be examined and talked about more. So thank you for bringing that to light. That's actually a really interesting piece that I think also plays into some other history that I know that Tracey was really interested in highlighting. If y'all wouldn't mind having a conversation about that. We started a little bit on Tuesday talking about the state constitution of South Carolina in 1868 and how immediately after the Civil War, there were lots and lots of rights that by 1895 were stripped away from people of African descent. So I'm gonna let Tracey actually lead into that conversation how he'd like to, but I know that you've got something great to teach us and to relate again between the history and the modern era. So Tracey.
Yeah, thanks, thanks, Carin and Bob. We touched on this yesterday with Lee and wanted to take the opportunity to kind of delve a little bit deeper with you and with your background and history knowledge. You know, it just when we talk about connecting history to today, it's especially here in South Carolina, it just this part of history for people like me that sort of live it and and are immersed in it. A lot of times I like to think of what ifs, and it's this kind of fun game that historians sometimes play, like what if this had happened, or what if this had not happened. And one of the questions that's been on my mind lately is, what if South Carolina had stayed with its Constitution of 1868? What if it had not changed in 1895? Because that 1895 Constitution led to so many injustices that are still with us now. And that 1868 Constitution allowed personhood voting, and it cultivated an environment that everyone was able to, I'm sorry, I say everyone, I'm sorry, Carin, not females. It was only males. But the races were able to be together, you might say, politically. And there were so many successes in the African American community here in South Carolina on a political level that happened in the 1870s. And, you know, even the first representative in our in U.S. Congress was a gentleman from South Carolina, you know, in the 1870s. And I'm sure a lot of people don't know that. I would never have thought that a state like South Carolina, with its history, that the first African American serving in Congress came from this state. But it all got stripped away. It all got changed in 1895, and we were set on a different course.
Well, one of the things that's also very interesting, and this is something I've been working on as well, is we've been here in Boston, it's evident, there's been these various recognitions and celebrations of 250 years since the American Revolution. And states have been fighting about it. I know South Carolina, there was an interesting article where they accused Massachusetts of stealing the revolution, but all the states are fighting for that. But no one is talking about 150 years since Reconstruction, which was dealing with a lot of the unfinished business, one could say, from the years of the Revolution, particularly that of slavery and inequalities. And the Reconstruction period was an amazing period that has been vilified and overlooked in the coverage of American history. But it was an amazing, amazing time, because it was the time when freedmen and free blacks got engaged in the government, got engaged in trying to create a society that had room for all. The 1868 convention in South Carolina is particularly special to me, because my paternal great uncle, Abram Middleton, was a delegate to that convention. He lived in Barnwell, South Carolina. And according to Earl Middleton's book, one of the things that was most interesting about him coming out of slavery was that he was literate not only in English, but also in Hebrew and Greek. And so he was a delegate to that convention. And he also became a pastor. And he went to theological school and was known as being responsible for building congregations and churches, because he was a carpenter as well as a preacher. And what's really amazing, his brother also became a pastor. And what's amazing is that in looking at that Constitution, the things that they were interested in instituting were very important. And I looked at three, and one in particular was about all men being born free and equal, which is one of those key points from the Declaration. It comes up all the time in the history of America and looking at what it means to be American. But one of the things that they also said was that among those rights were the rights to also defend their lives and liberties, right? Not just that you had the right to it, but you had the right to defend it. They also spoke about having liberty of conscience, right? The ability to think what you wanted to and deal with the consequences of those thoughts, but to be able to think and speak. And so this Constitution was one that really was written from those who had been written out of the previous Constitution of the United States. And this was taking place in all of those states in the South. However, almost immediately by 1776, with the ending of Reconstruction, efforts were afoot to change those constitutions, as those who had been supporters of the Confederacy regain control of government and institutions, the move came to disenfranchise Black people, which was done in South Carolina by 1895, and was done in other states by the beginning of the century. And so it was a denial of voting rights that had been given. And the sad thing about it was not just that it was those forces that took over the government again, but the federal government also turned a blind eye towards it. And so you had an increase in violence towards Black people. You had an increase in violence towards economic institutions, political institutions, and it led to huge amounts of death and so forth. And one could probably make some parallels with what's going on right now today. I'm not going to make them right now. I'll let folks think about it.
Well, and Robert, you know, it led right into Plessy versus Ferguson. I mean, it was the next year, you know.
Yeah.
So in South Carolina, you have a new constitution coming in that says that you have this literacy test for voting that excluded over 100,000 African Americans who were previously voting. They were the next day not able to vote. And then separate versus equal, you know, separate, you know, which of course wasn't equal, but that's right on the heels of this Constitution. So it's, you know, it's interesting. Almost more than validate. You said, I don't know the word you just used, complicit or validate. The federal government validated. They literally participated, you know, with that, and then that leads right into separate schools and Jim Crow.
And you know, it's interesting that the three branches of federal government were supportive of this: the judiciary, the executive, and the legislative. And you know, what it led to was an attack on educational institutions, an attack on social institutions, an attack on economic institutions. And so and so right now today, when people are saying, well, you know, how come, you know, Black people aren't doing better economically, they don't know about the destruction that took place in the late 19th century, in the early 20th century, in the mid 20th century. They just think that, oh, there was a civil rights movement and laws were passed and everything was fine. And so I think as a nation, we need to do a much better job at telling all sides of the history, as well as the positive, but also the ugliness, because history has its ugly side. But out of those dark periods comes the dawn, as they say.
You know, that's a, sorry, go ahead.
I was just, you know, the idea of today, and that period of the late 1800s in the early 20th century, you know, it makes me want to call back even further, you know, and we go back into days of slavery and the idea that this entire group of people cannot build generational wealth, didn't have that opportunity for centuries to build generational wealth. And that really for the Middletons began in Barbados when these two English brothers, Arthur and Edward Middleton, went to Barbados and became involved in the slave trade, trying to seek their own fortune and make their way in the world, and probably had the aspirations of owning land in Barbados and becoming sugar planters. But by the time they got there, the land was already taken away and being utilized, and they couldn't get their traction. So they came to Carolina after a few years. But in Carolina, they were able to bring enslaved people here and receive head rights, head right land for each of those people, and kind of begin this multi-generational wealth building in their family that, that began in 1678, that early, and really kind of culminates, into the Civil War period, when you've got a family that owns 19 different plantations around South Carolina. And of course, they're part of the planter class in the Low Country that's among the most wealthy people, if not the most wealthy class of people in the country at that time. And just thinking about the generational wealth that began by being built coming out of Barbados, and then centuries later, and even today, really, that generational wealth didn't stop building with the Civil War. But of course, that's the time that we look at a lot. And it's an apparent connection to history that we live right now.
Yep, it's very much a connection. And when we talk about land and generational wealth, South Carolina figures in, because that was one place where they began to put into practice initially the 40 acres and a mule along the Sea Islands, and how much of that land was taken back. Had folks been given 40 acres of land, had land been divided up and farms been created, that would have been a very different economic story going forward if that had been respected as well. But as we know, the redemption efforts attacked independence of Blacks, whether that was economic, political, social, or otherwise. And that is some of the heritage that we are still feeling right now as well, is that denial of opportunity with force.
Right,
Sure.
right.
I actually wanted to revisit something you mentioned, Bob, about people not learning this history, not being aware of it, not understanding where these inequities come from. And I know that you train student teachers to talk about African American history and African history and the diaspora to middle and secondary school students, right? Middle and high school. So can you talk a little bit about how you train next generations of teachers to include this, to do better?
Well, the first is that you have to really examine history fully, not sugarcoat it, not, close your eyes when you're passing the difficult places. You have to really delve into it. And you have to talk about how it is part and parcel of our landscape, pretty much, and raise questions about inequality. But also, how do you have those conversations with groups of students? How do you create a safe space in a classroom where those conversations can be had? Because that's what's important, is to have that space, whether you're in the classroom or in the field. They have to know that their comments will be respected, will be heard, will be addressed, even if they are wrong-headed, right? But that we're there to learn. And that, so even if you say something that in many instances people would recoil from and go, how could you say that? That's not the atmosphere you want to create. You want to create one where those kinds of comments can come forward and be heard and be corrected and be added to and be built upon, because that's a learning environment. And we have to be aware also of the world around us and where we are, and try to connect the history that we are studying to the places we are, right? It does no good for me to ignore the history of Boston, but to talk about California. Now, I'm not saying I only talk about the history of Boston, but you have to really make the place that you are real. And then you can build on that to connect to the rest of the country, the rest of the world. So that's important. I was thinking as I talked about liberty, that right in Charleston, in your backyard, you have one of the prime examples of that contradiction down in Liberty Square, which was where the Liberty Tree in Charleston was. And one of the big voices haranguing the Sons of Liberty was Christopher Gadsden, right? Who talked about liberty, etc., but his economic liberty was connected to Gadsden's Wharf, which was where many enslaved Africans were brought into Charleston. And so you have this conflicting image of liberty visually right there, stone's throw from each other. And that's a lesson that could be talked about and examined, especially today when one of the symbols that those who are marching with AR, whatever the guns are, I don't know, but one of the symbols they use is the Gadsden flag, right? Don't tread on me. And so at the same time that they're pulling up that symbol, not knowing that Christopher Gadsden was treading on some liberties, many liberties. So those are the kinds of lessons that could be brought forward in a way that is relevant to now, as well as understanding of the past.
Yeah,
That's great.
amen, Robert. You know, when you were just talking about your students and having those conversations, it reminded me of our friend here at Middleton Place, Jeff Neal, is our director of interpretation, and this story that he tells, I think, is a fantastic story. He's giving a tour one day about slavery at Middleton Place and talking about the enslaved people. And after it was over, he asked the group if they had any questions. And a lady, of course, a white lady, most of our visitors are white, taking these tours, asking these questions. She says, "Hey, you've taught me a lot today. I didn't realize that slaves had children." And Jeff says, she just immediately, her face turned red. She was embarrassed by saying such a thing, that of course they did. And she felt horrible for saying, or, just so embarrassed. And Jeff said, "Wait, no, you are opening the door for a conversation about enslaved people, that they were human beings. They were people. They were mothers and fathers just like us." And so it opened the door. She felt horrible, but yet it's like, no question's a bad question if it opens a door to a conversation like that and opens someone's mind to a new way of thinking.
And that also points to an underlying issue that we are seeing now as well, and that is the unwillingness to recognize a common humanity. To not think that enslaved people would have children is to think of them as something other than yourself, as not being part of the human family. And that is a problem. And often people feel like horrific treatment of Black people is justified because they're not like us. They're different. So they don't embrace that common humanity. When they talk about protest and they say, and their protest and they did this, I don't hear an hour usually, and so if we're not able to recognize a common humanity, right, that we breathe the same air, that we eat the same food, that we want basically the same things in life, then we're going to have continued problems, right? And so just, the idea of wanting to breathe the free air of liberty, right? And it's the "I can't breathe" phrase is very, very much a part of this, whether we're talking about what happened to George Lloyd, or whether we're talking about Raina Zoe Mungan, who, a young woman who went to the emergency room in New York saying, I can't breathe. And they refused to give her a COVID test. 3 times she had to go to the hospital before they admitted her. And by that time, it had progressed enough that she didn't survive, right? So when people can't breathe, they need to be heard. And right now, this is, you know, the country is erupting, the world is erupted because so many people are feeling that the breath of liberty cut off, choked off, wherever they may be, right? And the system in place is one that is not allowing everyone to breathe freely. And I don't know what it's going to take for change, but change has to come. And it has to start on every level. Substantive changes, you know, not just cosmetic changes where we add a few diverse faces, but we have to change even the structure of power, the way that we think about power, the way that we think about decision making, right? And who makes decisions, right? Do we include those people who are most impacted by it? Even just the idea, for instance, that $1,200 stimulus check was going to help people survive, right? That doesn't even pay rent, right? But the people who made the decisions would never have to survive on $1,200, not even for 1 week. So how do we open things up so that voices of those who are not heard begins to get heard?
You've got an eloquent voice for that, Bob. I wish I had half of it, but thank you so much for those words. I totally agree.
As do I, and I just have one more question for you, and I hope you will indulge me, because one of the things that you did while you were here with us last summer in South Carolina was to take a look at and evaluate for us Elizas House and how we exhibit the information there and how we tell that narrative. And as Middleton Place moves forward with a message of solidarity and a message of action within our mission of telling American history and being a community resource to connect that history to what's going on right now, to help us understand ourselves and each other, we want to constantly evolve our narratives. And Elizas House is a beautiful exhibit that has been up since 2005. So it has had, as Tracey likes to say, it's had good legs. It's had an incredible run, and it's also due for an update. It is overdue. And so this is an actionable item that we are looking at and doing right now to update and improve this narrative. And I was just wondering if you would be willing to give us just a small snippet, something that you suggested for us. For everybody who's watching, Robert not only analyzed the exhibit for us, he produced a beautiful report that we're working from in order to update our narrative. And I just wanted to know if there were a few things that stuck out in your mind that we are really going to and need to act on in particular.
Well, there's a lot in my report, but what I think needs to happen is to not see Elizas House as the locus and main place to tell the story of the African and African-American presence, but to also weave it into the narratives in other places, and more than it is now, which is at the house tour, to weave it into the chapel and the ice house, to weave it into the garden tours, to begin to really expand it so that the house, while it's there and there's a particular tour, but that people don't miss it. One of the things that happens if material isn't spread throughout is that people can be selective and miss the important stuff. But if it's weaved throughout, they have to get it. whether they want to or not. And in doing that, it will help them to see that it's okay to deal with this material. It's okay to learn about this stuff. It doesn't take away from me. And it helps to weave these two different stories together tighter in a way that they were. Because we have to remember that the institution of slavery was a very intimate institution. We're talking about people who are living side by side with one another, even with the power differentials. These people are their lives are intertwined in a lot of ways, good, bad, and ugly. And so if we don't weave these stories together, people miss that importance. And they miss that there is this, even with all of the elements of domination, there is also moments when common humanity rears its head.
Thank you so much. That's great. And we are taking action on all of those things. And I think you've given us a beautiful gift when you talk about the breath of liberty and how the reality of liberty means opposing things, not just different things to different people, but in some cases opposing things to different people. And that is certainly an aspect of narrative that I think we can really use and really take action with. So thank you very much. Is there anything else that you'd like to share? Tracey, do you have any other questions for Dr. Bellinger as we finish up the conversation just for today? Not for good, but for today.
Oh, no, not for good. I'm just thankful for Bob. I'm thankful for the time together with him as always, and look forward to him being here with us again at Middleton Place, hopefully soon. We've had to take a pause in our partnership program with Suffolk this summer because of COVID and everything, and we're certainly looking forward to rejuvenating that next summer and having Bob back. Definitely. And in 2021, there's another reunion coming up. So I'm looking forward to having Bob there for that. We'll probably talk to him about conducting a session for all the Middleton. So thank you, Bob.
Thank you, Tracey. Great talking to you. And Carin.
Great talking to you. Thank you. You as well. Hey, please say hi to Nick, the intern. Shout out to Nick who came here. We love you, Nick. Hi. Thank you. Thanks. Well,
now.
Thank you so much, Bob. Really appreciate it. Thank you. And everybody, thanks very much for tuning in to Explore More Thursday here with Middleton Place's Plugged into History digital programming. Really appreciate you being here. Make sure that if you have any other questions, hopefully you've been dropping questions in the comment section, but if you haven't been, you can now, and we'll make sure to forward those questions to Dr. Bellinger and get some answers for you that we can share here in the comments. So thank you all so much. Tracey, thanks for being here. Dr. Bellinger, Bob, thank you so much for joining us. We will hopefully talk to you again very soon. Thank you very much. We'll see y'all another time.
All right.